Who belongs in America? Everybody? Nobody? Or just the right kind of people? America has experimented with inconsistent policies for over 2 centuries attempting to answer this question. Whenever convenient, Asian Americans have been labeled as problems, solutions, traitors, and allies, but rarely have they been seen as Americans. Even today, as so-called model minorities, Asian Americans face the reality of being perceived as outsiders by society and the media. This is the story of systematic and societal exploitation, oppression, and alienation that Chinese and Japanese Americans faced when trying to make America their home. The Chinese were among the very first Asians to immigrate to the United States. For over 110 years, nearly every Chinese immigrant hailed from Guangdong, the prosperous southern province that rivaled the entire United States in population. As a result of Qing imperial government restrictions, Canton was the only Chinese city where foreign trade was allowed, but together with the foreign-controlled ports of Hong Kong and Macau, Guangdong served as the sole gateway for Chinese emigration. Due to the speed and efficiency of international shipping networks, residents of Canton received word of a gold rush in California just days after the same reports reached New York City in October of 1848. By 1849, the first sizable group of Chinese immigrants arrived in California, leaving behind an economic recession to seek fortunes in gold mining, and giving San Francisco the Chinese name Old Gold Mountain. Within months of their arrival, the first signs of racial animosity became evident. A mob of angry white miners swept through Chinese Camp California and forced some 60 Chinese miners to abandon their prospecting sites. Despite the hostility, the Chinese were not deterred. By 1852, California's Chinese population reached nearly 25,000 and represented a quarter of the state's mining workers. This prompted California Governor John Bigler to declare that the concentration of Asiatic races threatened the well-being of the mining districts. However, by the time of the Civil War, the Chinese were seen as the solution to severe labor shortages affecting construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1868, President Andrew Johnson signed the Burlingame Treaty, which encouraged immigration of indentured Chinese laborers. The treaty worked, and between 1870 and 1880, over 123,000 Chinese immigrants came to join the existing population. As their numbers grew, so did the hatred against them. Increasingly outspoken newspapers and labor unions lined up their support for a Chinese immigration ban and encouraged violence against the Chinese as a method of hastening their departure. They claimed the Chinese were an unassimilable race that threatened the supremacy of America's white population. The movement rapidly gained political traction, and in 1879, anti-Chinese lawmakers amended California's state constitution to make the Chinese ineligible to vote, along with idiots and the insane. The momentum of the anti-Chinese movement quickly moved beyond California and into the national spotlight. Just 3 years later, on May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed into federal law by President Chester A. Arthur, barring Chinese immigrants without existing ties to citizens and explicitly banning Chinese laborers. The impact was felt almost immediately, with Chinese immigration dropping by 97% a year after it went into effect. The passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act also served to legitimize the campaign of intimidation and terror that had and would continue to be waged against the Chinese. Over 200 anti-Chinese riots, lynchings, and massacres ensued, with the intention of eradicating the Chinese from the country. In the words of one Chinese immigrant, "It is not exclusion, it is extermination." In order to implement the Chinese Exclusion Act, the government needed a system to control and restrict entry of the Chinese, who were ineligible for citizenship and thus perpetual foreigners. In 1893, the Angel Island immigration station opened in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. Over 175,000 potential Chinese immigrants disembarked at the station until its closure in 1940. The Angel Island station was first and foremost a detention center where immigration officials could question and hopefully deport incoming Chinese immigrants who claimed family ties to immigrants who were already in the country. The process was designed to reject as many as possible, putting immigrants through a series of intensive interrogations where a single wrong answer was cause for deportation. Chinese immigrants were detained while their applications were considered, a process that could last weeks or years depending on the circumstances. As a testament to their misery while in detention, many Chinese immigrants carved poetry in the walls to pass the time, lamenting their experiences at Angel Island. Despite their efforts to keep the Chinese out, immigration officials were fighting an uphill battle in the absence of key documents which burned in the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Exploiting the circumstances, new Chinese immigrants became paper sons to Chinese Americans claiming to be family members. By memorizing hundreds of detailed questions about the lives they supposedly lived in China, they could effectively defeat the system meant to keep them out. Nearly 90% of Chinese immigrants, whether actually related to American citizens or not, were allowed entry. Regardless of the success of Paper Sons, the Chinese Exclusion Act was effective. According to the Census Bureau, over a 40-year period, the number of Chinese immigrants allowed into the country annually never exceeded 5,000, while at the same time, Europeans poured into the country at rates that exceeded 1.2 million per year. Around the same time, Japan's self-imposed period of isolation ended with the Meiji Restoration, and Japanese immigrants slowly began arriving, replacing the dwindling Chinese population as a source of labor. As soon as they arrived, anti-Chinese sentiment expanded to target the Japanese. Small but outspoken organizations like the Asiatic Exclusion League formed to demand similar restrictions on Japanese immigration and lobbied for segregation of the Japanese in San Francisco's public schools. The Japanese, they said, were a silent invasion of an unassimilable race.
I can testify that they are as different from ourselves as any people on this planet.
To satisfy the demands of the Asiatic Exclusion League and avoid insulting the Japanese government, the United States rapidly negotiated the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, preventing segregated schools in San Francisco but severely limiting Japanese immigration. The start of World War II saw dramatic consequences for Chinese and Japanese communities living in America. The Japanese invasion of China in 1937 had already set the stage for these changes, and by 1941, the Republic of China officially allied itself with the United States, ultimately leading to the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act 2 years later. The Chinese, they said, were no longer the source of America's problems, but part of the solution instead. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, public opinion and government actions immediately turned on the Japanese-American community. A wave of mass hysteria initiated by the press ensued, questioning whether anyone of Japanese descent could be trusted. In response, on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, hastily creating an immense system of forced relocation, incarceration, and deportation for anyone of Japanese ancestry living in a massive exclusion zone across the western United States. Claiming to safeguard Americans against acts of sabotage or espionage, Order 9066 forced nearly 120,000 people of Japanese descent from their homes and into wartime relocation centers, regardless of the fact that the majority of them were American citizens. 11 internment camps were set up within months throughout the country, spanning from Arkansas to Hawaii. For many Japanese Americans, the desolate Manzanar War Relocation Center was where they spent the duration of World War II. Located in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada, some 200 miles north of Los Angeles, Manzanar was isolated by design. Guard towers and barbed wire fence lined the 4-mile perimeter of the camp, keeping watch over 36 blocks of identical barracks where 10,000 internees were forced to call home. The process of Japanese internment was not simply involuntary relocation and detention, but also a method of compulsory Americanization. English classes, church, baseball, and other patriotic activities were all part of an extensive effort to instill a sense of American belonging and neutralize the threat of their Japanese heritage, all from the confines of a camp that kept them as far away from ordinary Americans as possible. Life inside the camp was far from normal, but the internees made every effort to instill a sense of normalcy where they could. The Manzanar Free Press published news every day, keeping internees informed of outside events and documenting everyday life within the camp. Articles about Girl Scout troops and baseball games graced the headlines along stories of evictions and segregation of Japanese Americans who lived outside the exclusion zone and avoided internment. Although they were largely isolated from the outside world, the people living at Manzanar operated a sizable economy of 4,000 workers who earned up to $19 a month as mechanics, teachers, doctors, and any other profession that kept the camp running. Almost 500 interned Japanese Americans worked in Manzanar's camouflage net factory, supporting the same war effort that prompted their forced relocation. Remarkably, it was only after the Japanese Americans were confined to internment camps that they were screened to determine their loyalty to the United States. The screening came in the form of a questionnaire that asked invasive personal details of each person, but it was the last question, number 28, that was key to determining loyalty. It asked, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attacks by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?" Answering yes would allow them to stay in their respective internment camps. However, some people answered no, attempting to say that they could not forswear allegiance to the Japanese Emperor because they had never pledged to it in the first place. Others answered no as a form of protest against their treatment at the hands of the government. Anyone who answered no joined over 18,000 Japanese Americans who were further isolated in the maximum security Tule Lake Segregation Center.
In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do.
Ms. Hanabusa, you're next.
I sit before you, the granddaughter of two internees. Both of my grandfathers were interned during World War II. Those who were interned just did not speak about it. I believe that it is essential that we as a nation recognize our darkest moments so that we don't have them repeat again. This president's budget eliminates the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grants Program. So, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to know, even with the president zeroing it out, will we see it funded again in 2018?
Oh, konnichiwa.
I think it's still Ohayo gozaimasu, but that's okay.